Many of you have met me before. I'm Ravneet. I'm one of the 4IM chief residents. It's good to see you all here today. Thank you for making it in person. I know more people will trickle in a little bit later. And thank you to our online audience for joining us, even if you can't be here in person. As usual, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and I'll be monitoring the WebEx throughout the talk. And we'll prioritize in-person questions first, but we'll sprinkle in the online questions from the online audience if we have time. Before I get started, I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the day, who will introduce our formal ground round speaker, Dr. Fabrice Jodorand, who is the Cornelia Hayes Stevens Endowed Chair and Director of the OHSU Center for Ethics in Healthcare. He is a philosopher and medical ethicist with a secondary appointment as a senior researcher at the Institute for Biomedical Ethics in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Basel in Switzerland. Originally from Switzerland, he moved to the United States in 1995 to pursue his education and academic career. He brings an international, multicultural, and multidisciplinary perspective to issues related to medicine and healthcare delivery, an essential approach to today's pluralistic society. Dr. Jodorand has published more than 90 articles, book chapters, and reviews in leading academic journals. He's also published 9 books, including his latest monograph entitled The Unfit Brain and the Limits of Moral Bioenhancement. He's currently working on another monograph, continuing his exploration into professional identity formation in medicine, as physicians are often described and reduced to technicians, to service providers, or even to vending machines. It examines the current anthropological frameworks that shape our understandings of what it means to be human in a technocratic society and their implications for identity formation of physicians as human beings, as professionals. Please give a round of applause to Dr. Jodorand.
Well, thank you for this kind invitation, and thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Woodruff. So he's visiting OHSU to deliver today's lecture as part of our Madeleine Brill-Nelson speaker series. So it's a real treat because he has a lot of insights. I've known Jim for what now, 4 years, 5 years? We met at the conference, and then we started collaborating. We even have, sorry for the publicity bit, we started a podcast, even the two of us, called The Philosophical Pulse. And what we do, we talk about medicine, medical education, and philosophy. So this is a new endeavor. So please, if you're interested in these questions, look, you'll find it on various platforms. Sorry for this little advertisement. Dr. Woodruff is the Dean of Students for the Pritzker School of Medicine. In this role, he supports medical students in their professional development, specialty selection, and residency application. A graduate of the Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeon, Dr. Woodruff completed his internal medicine residency and chief residency in the Department of Medicine at the University of Chicago. His 8-year tenure as director of the internal medicine residency program and 6-year tenure as the Department of Medicine vice chair for education provide him with broad perspective on the medical training pathway. Dr. Woodruff remains a core faculty member of the internal medicine residency with responsibility for managing 14 fellowship training programs. He is a practicing general internist, caring for patients in both ambulatory and inpatient settings in the South Side of Chicago. So please join me to welcome Dr. Woodruff. The title of his presentation is The Anatomy of Reason, Supporting Critical Thinking and Flourishing in Medicine Through the Humanities. So thanks for coming.
I suppose I need to stand here at the podium because of the sound. Okay, great, thanks. So thank you so much, Fabrice, for the invitation to be the Nelson's speaker this spring. I very much appreciate your confidence in me. Fabrice and I have been working to try and translate ideas that I believe and he believes are really important from philosophy into something we can use every day in our work taking care of patients. And so I've sort of been brought in to try and convince this audience that this is really not just a sidecar, but is something that's integral to our decision-making every second of every minute of every day. And I'm hoping that by the end of the presentation, you'll understand why. I'd also like to thank Terry for hosting this event here. I appreciate it very much, and it was pleasant sort of getting to know you just before the presentation. So we face a lot of challenges in medicine right now. This is a list of some of them, and they're incredibly wicked problems. They're very difficult to address. And we haven't been very successful with that, despite investing in significant amounts of resources and time to try and address them. And I think that's for a very important reason, or at least there's something that's contributing to this difficulty that we need to acknowledge, which is that I think we have a model of training and practice that is incomplete, as opposed to actually accounting for these elements of practice in our daily practice, professional values and adaptive capacity, which admittedly are somewhat subjective. We oftentimes imagine practice as something that is completely objective and pursued with the use of knowledge and technology as our main strategy. But I think that's a mistake. I think that this subjectivity over here, which includes ethics and other value systems, as well as our adaptive capacity, are essential components of practice in complex environments that we work in every day. And that imagining those environments as simple problems is one of the challenges that's going to keep us from addressing these complex issues that I showed on the prior slide. One of the arguments I'm going to make today is that this subjectivity is not a bug in reasoning. It is a feature of reasoning. And unless we acknowledge that and attend to that, and maybe even cultivate the use of that subjectivity effectively, we will never be able to address the issues that I outlined on the previous slide. And so the challenge to us as medical educators and practitioners is to think about, how do we incorporate this into our day-to-day practice in a way that helps us navigate the complexity that we are faced with? So as opposed to an emphasis on technologic and scientific conventions as an approach to addressing the needs of our patients, we should have an emphasis on thinking that optimizes the impact of the science and technology that we have. Okay. So we're going to pursue a conversation today. Admittedly, most of it is going to be one-sided for most of this presentation. And we're going to talk about how reason works and how subjectivity is an essential and unavoidable part of rigorous practice in every decision that we make. This is a little unusual for Grand Rounds because we're going to be focusing not so much on technology and new knowledge. We're going to actually focus on our thinking. We're going to think about our thinking, which I think is one of the things that we don't do enough in practice, but also in many of conferences like this. So I'm going to pick an example here that is so objective that it's hard to think of anything that's more objective. 2 + 2 = 4, okay? And I'm going to ask you to think about that for a second. And ask yourself, is that true? Is 2 + 2 4? And if so, why? Okay. And I think most of us would respond to this by saying this is self-evident. Okay. 2 + 2 = 4 is self-evident. We don't need to think any more deeply than that. There's no point to pursue critical thinking with this. But the truth is that 2 + 2 doesn't necessarily equal 4, because there are many different base systems of math. And unless you acknowledge basically the mental model and the values, the subjective portions of that mathematical equation, you aren't being rigorous with your thinking, okay? So with the mental model, you're trying to identify what the problem is and what the context of the problem is. With the values, you're trying to identify tactical and strategic goals for the problem solving, and then come to practices. But they only come after you've been thinking about the problem, you've identified the problem, and you have a general strategy that you'd like to take. If, on the other hand, you ignore attention to these areas, to your subjectivity, and you simply say 2 + 2 = 4, then you are practicing a convention, a thoughtless convention, transmitted by education, transmitted by culture. Okay, you're making assumptions without thinking that allow you to pursue 2 + 2 = 4. Now, of course, there are benefits to conventions. They are efficient. They're perceived as easy to use. They offer us all some sense of certainty, although we know from having looked at this slide that it's not certain. It's just that we have a sense that this is certain because everybody else is thinking the same thing. Maybe not everybody. But there are problems. There's cognitive entrenchment where we get stuck in one system of thinking, even though there's an infinite number of rational systems of thinking. We have intolerance. When somebody comes to us and they have a different idea about 2 + 2 = 4, we can get angry at them. We can call them ignorant. We can call them disturbed. We can call them evil if they don't agree with our conventions. And there's impairment of rigor, discovery, innovation, and well-being. Many of the most important discoveries over the past 3 centuries in science are actually related to subjectivity. They're changes in mental models. So this is a rich resource for innovation. When you actually pursue critical thinking, you enhance adaptive expertise. We're going to talk more about that in a little while. We're going to enhance rigor. You have greater tolerance of diversity because you recognize that there's multiple different ways to tackle some of these problems. And actually, maybe we're focused on the wrong problem. And the problems, the perceived problems with this are that it requires inquiry and maybe interaction with the humanities to really refine our inquiry skills. It's perceived as less efficient, but in the long run, it actually might be more efficient. And it questions certainty. We can get angry sometimes when people tell us, well, I'm not sure I agree with that, even though we believe with all our heart that this is self-evident, when in fact, it's just a convention. It actually impacts our ability. Critical thinking allows us to build a larger toolbox. So for example, base 2 thinking is the framework for the entire computer revolution, okay? So sticking with base 10 just because it's a convention means that you're actually limiting your ability to innovate and create new tools to take care of patients, for example. Now, the base system is a representational system. The math is the same, okay? And so it's about assumptions related to the problem of how you represent math, okay? But it turns out there's multiple layers to this. There's actually assumptions about how math works. So we can look at Euclidean geometry. When we say geometry, we tend to think of Euclidean geometry. That's our default, that's our convention. But did you know that if you actually decide to eliminate the 5th postulate, you get non-Euclidean geometry. And what you get is a geometry that allows you to do calculations on curved surfaces, which is valuable for like relativity and for mapping on a globe, okay? So you can expand your toolbox even further by combining these different sets of assumptions, changing assumptions, instead of just thinking about things through conventions, okay? Now, Aristotle understood this well over 2,000 years ago. He believed in the idea of first principles in metaphysics, which is basically the belief that one's mental model of the world, the universe, impacts your thinking and your logic. Now, at the time of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, people became very averse to the idea of subjectivity, and they tried very hard to remove it from reason, leaving purely objective approaches to problem solving. In the last century, we found actually that effort failed, though we tend not to acknowledge that, okay? And then at the very end of the century, the last century, something really interesting happened as we were basically beginning sort of this practice of conventions without critical thinking. New literature came out from the cognitive science literature by Barcelau that basically proposed that analytic thinking is not the foundation of the way people pursue reasoning. So for 400 years, we believed that logical analysis was the foundation of reasoning. And what the psychologists found is actually it's mental models, the subjectivity that's at the starting point of reasoning that I showed earlier, that is actually the foundation of reasoning. So we've circled back to actually Aristotle's ideas about how it is humans reason through challenging problems, that it begins with our subjectivity. And that subjectivity is an essential and irreplaceable part of our reasoning. And that if we remove it, we are left with something hollow. We are left with conventions without understanding what the problems are that we're dealing with, without understanding what tactical and strategic values may be of use, like values that are found in our ethics. And so Barcelau, whose paper now has over 10,000 citations, helped us restore critical thinking, at least in cognitive science, by returning us to a focus on mental models and values as part of the approach of reasoning, okay? So I'm just going to show every once in a while that there's actually references in the philosophy literature that have looked at a lot of these questions. And so regarding something we hold dear to our heart, which is the sciences, we tend to think of science as purely objective, but actually science has a history of subjectivity. You can look at this really wonderful classic book on the sociology of science called The Leviathan and the Air Pump to see that actually the scientific method developed within the context of politics, okay? And it was influenced by society at that time. And we also have something from the last century, which is Lorraine Daston, who was the head of the Max Planck Institute, a history of science professor who visited the University of Chicago regularly for many years, who talks about the moral economy of science, that there are values, subjective values, that are part of what we think of as objective science. We cannot avoid them. We cannot avoid the subjectivity if we want to pursue rigorous work. Okay. So we're going to move now from the anatomy to the physiology, and I'm going to move a little bit faster now. I'm going to create a whole sort of model for us to think about this that actually divides some of the physiologic steps so that we can actually wrap our minds around what is happening. So you see here on the far left, the iceberg again, which by the way is from Shine's classic book on organizational culture, but it's a nice way to outline reasoning in a very succinct way with the mental models, values, the assumptions underneath the water, and the practices that are apparent to all of us above the water. Now, the point of problem solving is actually a two-step process that begins with exploration and then moves on to exploitation. This is from a classic article in the organizational science literature by March. In exploration, we actually are developing mental models that help us think about the problem that we're trying to address. What is the problem? What is the context of the problem? And then with that information, what are the tactical and strategic values that will help us solve the problem? And then we go into action above the water and we solve the problem. We exploit that problem-solving framework that's developed below the waterline. Okay. Another group of people in the organizational learning science literature, Argyris and Schoen, actually divided this into two steps, which is the first step of understanding and inquiry, which is loop B here at the bottom of the slide, followed by appropriate actions relative to the mental model that we've developed. And we get a contextually appropriate goal. Now we can think about this in the context of a startup company. When a startup company starts, they build a business plan. The building of the business plan is down here. This is their operating system for them if they're like a metaphorical computer. And then the actions that startup company takes to execute the business plan and to make money is up here. It's loop A. It's focused on the PDSAs that are required to refine that plan and to be successful. Okay, I think most of you are familiar with PDSA, Plan, Do, See, Act. We talk about it a lot in quality and medicine. We rarely go below the waterline to talk about what comes before PDSA, but what these folks are arguing is that there is a subjective piece below the waterline that comes before PDSA. Now, as this company matures, it has to think less often about their business plan and instead can focus on the operations of their business. And so this process of understanding and inquiry about values and mental models is not something that comes up regularly. People just do their job, okay? And hopefully they provide a good product. But because they live in a marketplace, in a world that's constantly changing, we can't give up on loop B. It needs to be ready to be brought out of the closet and used on a regular basis. This ability to toggle back and forth between these two sides of the slide is called adaptive expertise. The capability to balance the efficient use of previously acquired knowledge with the creation of new knowledge in response to novelty and complexity. And if you were to look at medicine as a whole, we've sort of compartmentalized that. We have research and development, and then we have folks like myself, a primary care doctor out there applying what's been learned. But the truth is, as I'm taking care of patients, I should be retaining a bit of loop B in my work every day. And if I can't do that, then I cannot provide patient-centered care because I'm learning every second, every minute, taking care of that patient in the context of their lives, okay? That's part of the problem that we're facing with all these challenges is that we're leaving sort of the exploration, loop B, to somebody else, and then we're just applying, I think, the guidelines or the evidence in a very rigid way. Now, in order to toggle back and forth and actually look below the waterline, we need metacognition. So metacognition is a really important part psychologically of this whole process. Critical thinking relies on metacognition. So what is metacognition? It's the ability to think about our thinking, okay? There are only a handful of species that are capable of doing this. There's a few cetaceans, and then there's a few simian species that can do this. If we think of evolution as something that is sort of the accumulation of new forms of adaptation, this represents yet another layer of adaptation that makes us incredibly creative, incredible problem solvers, because we can actually think about and regulate our own thinking. But I would put it to you that we actually don't in our medical education and in our education in general, very often teach people to think about their own thinking. There are a few disciplines that do that. Of course, there's philosophy, right? This is what ethics is about. It's about thinking about your own thinking. It is not the application of just themes or topics like there's some sort of fund of knowledge. The heart of ethics is not really the knowledge piece. It is a way of thinking about how it is we interact with each other, what our responsibilities are to each other. And by turning it into just another technology, another bit of knowledge, we actually undermine our ability to pursue ethical practice. It is a way of thinking, first and foremost. Now, there's actually data on metacognition and its impact on both efficacy of problem solving and wellness. So this is why I'm talking about flourishing in the title of my talk and why it's so important to medical education and practice. We're interested in helping our patients flourish, but we also want our practitioners to flourish. So metacognition may be captured in some of these questions. What are my assumptions? Are they valid? Shall I change my assumptions? And then there are social dimensions. What are their assumptions? And are they more valid than mine? And the data shows that metacognition supports higher orders of judgment. For example, critical reasoning, self-regulated learning. It enhances team communication, cognitive processes, satisfaction, and problem solving. So it's very important for teams. And it supports empathic patient care while simultaneously offering protection from empathic distress. How many of you have asked the question while you're taking care of patients or training students, how it is we can teach people to be empathic while at the same time keeping them well, right? And the answer is metacognition, because through metacognition, we can actually deliver on both, okay? We can have our cake and we can eat it too with metacognition. And then dysfunction of metacognition is associated with test anxiety, maladaptive coping, anxiety, and depression. These are things we see frequently in our students, in our residents, and honestly, in our peers as practitioners. Dysfunction also underlies the loss of resilience. And it also is associated with more extreme judgments and the assumption that others share your moral position. I want you to think back on the last 2 years of discourse about the politics of this country and the world, and think about how hard it was for people to see other people's perspective. That's a problem with metacognition, okay? That's a problem with metacognition. And then back to some literature from philosophy. If you want to understand the importance of subjectivity in rigorous decision-making, one needs to read about practical wisdom. And then Aristotle attaches that practical wisdom to the achievement of flourishing, which is that all of us achieve our full potential and derive happiness from that accomplishment. The Consolation of Philosophy is a book by Boethius that he wrote in the final months of his life, imprisoned in a tower by the invading hordes from the north. This was at the fall of Rome. And in the months before he was executed, he found solace in philosophy. And the way he describes it in his book is that the woman philosophy came to visit him in his prison and helped comfort him as he navigated the final weeks of his life. And these are all really wonderful books that are not just about rigorous thinking, critical thinking, but their attachment to flourishing and wellness. Let's talk about the pathophysiology of reason and critical thinking. So some organizations fail to maintain that metacognitive asset, and they get stuck in loop A. They pursue exploitation of established problem-solving frameworks, and then they resist critical examination of that framework as the world changes around them, or as a new patient comes into the office and they aren't going to take the time or the interest in changing the way they're thinking about this new patient compared to the last one. And these efforts to try and change one's framework are resisted. And instead, they're sort of remolded into a rationalization of keeping the original framework of problem solving, often at the expense of the organization or professional success. So some examples from the business community are Blockbuster Video, right? Xerox, right? Kodak. These are companies that failed to keep up with the changing environment. They stuck to their original framework of problem solving, and they didn't have the metacognitive capacity to say, what's changing? How can we maintain success? How can we pursue rigor into the future beyond just sticking with the problem solving framework that we originally had? This is called cognitive entrenchment, the tendency for extensive domain experience to constrain how problems are perceived, interpreted, and solved. This is called the Einstellung effect in psychology, where expertise becomes a liability. It prevents people from actually thinking about the problem other ways. Okay. And I want to remind you that this dysfunction of metacognition is associated with significant problems in terms of one's happiness, but also one's ability to be rigorous in problem solving. You are limiting your toolbox in a maladaptive way by accepting conventions and not investing in metacognition. This is a philosophic text written by Heidegger, and Heidegger has a very challenging history as a person, but thinking about his ideas, this idea about technology and its effect on Western society is really perceptive. It's a difficult read, but it is shorter, and it's worth it if you're willing to work through it to read this, because what it argues is that technology has become a way of revealing the world that obscures truth and makes us blind to other ways of seeing and being. I want you to reflect back on that initial slide that showed the two paradigms, the technician versus the professional. And the technician, their entire strategy is about knowledge and technology, okay? So we live in a society that has been entranced in many ways by the incredible leaps we've had in knowledge and technology. And we've begun to believe that that is sufficient to provide the care that is necessary for unique patients that come through our office. But in the end, as I've shown you, the subjectivity is essential to complement that, to identify the problems, the context, the strategic and tactical goals for our work. So I'm going to give you a case now, an example, and it's a very pervasive case so that we can push this point home in a way that we'll all understand about the work that we do day in and day out. And it relates to systems thinking. Remember when the term systems thinking first came out and everybody was sort of like, what does that mean? What does that mean? Now systems thinking is in every part of our practice, in the guidelines from the LCME and the ACGME's guidelines. JACO, I'm sure, talks about systems thinking all the time. When we talk about quality, we say systems thinking, systems thinking. Well, think about it for a second. What does systems thinking really mean? What does it mean to you? And I'm going to spend a little time actually talking about the history of it so you know that actually for most of us, including myself, until not too long ago, I had a misunderstanding about what systems thinking really represents. This was brought to the table most officially in the Crossing the Quality Chasm report from the Institute of Medicine that basically said that we need systems thinking to address healthcare quality and safety in the United States. But the problem was it didn't do a good job of expressing what systems thinking was really about. Systems thinking came about because scientists in biology and some other fields over a century ago began to realize that the scientific method, which is an analytic method, meaning you actually take complex systems and you break them into pieces that are easier to study, you understand those pieces, and then you reassemble what you've learned and you assume that the whole is the same as simply adding the parts together, that approach, that analytic thinking, falls short in describing complex systems. Because in complex systems, the interactions between those components are as important as what's happening in each one of those components. Okay. So the degree of complexity impacts the optimal choice of problem-solving methods. And in complex systems, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. Therefore, scientific analysis alone can never give you an accurate understanding of complex systems. System assumptions must regularly be examined. This is loop B thinking, and methods adjusted accordingly, which is loop A, okay? So systems thinking, as it says in the title, is about thinking. It is not about practices, okay? It is about thinking about our assumptions. It is critical thinking, okay? About how complexity is going to affect our assumptions and the reasoning we apply to the problems we face in our environment. And there's literature that shows that this approach makes sense. Not surprisingly, critical thinking enhances clinical care, counseling, team dynamics, restorative justice, and regulation. It helps all those things because you're thinking more deeply about the problems you're trying to solve, the nature of those problems, what might work before you take action, okay? Seems common sense, but the truth is that's not what we took away from systems thinking. Systems thinking is asking us to think about what our assumptions are, just like we had with the base systems in math. What system of logic are we working within with this problem that will be used to describe teamwork? Because teamwork, communication, and improvement were some of the main themes that came out of the system thinking literature. And everybody started saying, all you need is teamwork, communication, and improvement, and you're going to be doing systems thinking practice. Well, the truth is that's not quite the case, because you need to actually do a review of the assumptions in order to conclude what the right kind of teamwork is, what the right kind of communication is, what the right kind of improvement is. And we weren't doing that. We were simply sticking with conventions. The ACGME included systems-based practice as their version of systems thinking in the assessment tools for residency training programs. And it has spread now throughout medicine. And basically what they did was they substituted thinking with practice, okay? And they ignored all the assumptions, which was the heart of what systems thinking was about. In effect, what they did was they took a solution to conventions and they converted it into a convention, okay? So when we talk about systems thinking now, we more often think of it as a set of practices, teamwork, communication, and improvement, without actually asking the question, what do we mean by teamwork, communication, and improvement, which can only be assessed through looking at our assumptions. So here are some examples. Continuous quality improvement. Continuous quality improvement in systems thinking means we're doing both loop B and loop A activities. But very often in quality improvement efforts, what you see is that it's just become continuous loop A, okay? Because after all, loop A is improvement efforts, quality improvement efforts, and doing that continuously is continuous quality improvement, right? Okay. Well, no, it's not, okay? Continuous quality improvement is regularly revisiting your assumptions, developing appropriate targets that are contextually appropriate, and then taking action. It is not continuous action in one framework, okay? That is not systems thinking, but that's the misunderstanding, because we function very much like a limited learning system. We take ideas that were meant to improve our ability to use metacognition, and we convert them right into practices, competencies, behavioral anchored assessments, performance metrics, quality measures that are standardized. These are our landscape now. We are in a limited learning organization. And our patients suffer because each patient is different, but we're standardized, okay? Let's go on to the example of teamwork. Teamwork in systems thinking means two different loops. There's loop B in civil discourse, where actually diversity and inclusion are the major theme, followed by loop A, which is actual execution of the plans that you've developed with loop B. And what we've done is simply left it as teams, which ends up being force multiplication and specialization, where actually alignment is one of the values. And this is part of the tension about DEI, is that we keep on thinking about loop A when actually we should be thinking about both loop B and A. There is a place for DEI in rigorous patient care that is essential. And it is inevitably part of our decision-making, whether we choose to use it or not. And so this is, again, a strong argument for DEI and problem solving, not just in social justice. So again, just to reinforce the point, we are actually living in a system that values conventions. All of our assessment tools, the way we teach our students, our residents, the way we hold each other accountable is based upon behaviors and outcomes, with little attention to the thinking, the thought process, the subjectivity that actually lay underneath that and actually determines the trajectory of all the practices, okay? The practices are not being pursued rigorously because they're unanchored by what the problem is and what are appropriate strategies for dealing with that problem. Standardized quality measures, accreditation and certification standards, competency-based medical education, all of it falls into the same trap unless we're actively thinking about our assumptions. But we're not teaching people to think about their assumptions. So this final part of the presentation is to talk about some of the interventions that we put together at the University of Chicago at our Pritzker School of Medicine where we've tried very much to stimulate metacognitive activity, where we're asking people to think, to learn how to think critically about what they're doing, not just skills and knowledge, okay? So we're gonna move through a couple of those interventions. I have this slide here that just sort of gives you the landscape of the things that we've been working on. As a student affairs dean, I am delighted because I don't have the LCME telling me exactly how to run my curriculum. In fact, nobody expects me to have a curriculum as a student affairs dean. That's the curriculum dean, right? So that creates the opportunity for me to focus on something that isn't necessarily compliant with the LCME's expectations regarding a curriculum, which is about reproducibility, measurement, all the things that actually cause us to adhere to the wrong problem-solving framework. I can actually ignore, and I can do things that are much more creative and dynamic. And so these are some of the themes that come up in our interventions: growth orientation, community of practice forms, storytelling, discourse ground rules, civil discourse, and DEI. These are all admittedly in the category of subjective. And for that reason, in our society, in our civilization, they tend to be marginalized. They tend to be thought of as something outside of rigor. They tend to be thought of as a bug to rigor, when in fact, as I've shown you, they are an inevitable part of our practices, whether we choose to recognize it or not. And it's in our best interest to acknowledge them and attend to them if we really want to be rigorous and creative and have the biggest possible toolbox. So let's talk about growth orientation. Growth mindset has become really popular around the country at all levels of education. Many of you may have children that are getting exposed to growth mindset. Well, guess what? It's useful for medical students too. So growth mindset outperforms fixed mindset academically. And students can be taught growth mindset. So if they come to medical school with fixed mindset, and I'll tell you that most of them do come with fixed mindset after the pre-medical curriculum that they've been through, you can teach them growth mindset. The environment has impact, the growth orientation of the environment. Curricular designed around active learning, which is constructing knowledge, outperforms didactics. Constructing knowledge means starting with your assumptions and moving through to actual knowledge. It's critical thinking, okay? And then surprise that curricula designed around that concept to do better. And it also reduces disparities. Teachers subscribing to constructed knowledge outperform those that are teaching facts. And regarding well-being, and this parallels the metacognition research, growth mindset predicts higher psychological well-being. And a single session of growth mindset can actually impact children and students for as long as 9 months. A half hour, an hour-long presentation can change people's trajectory regarding their mental health. Not just about rigor now, but also about wellness. So growth as a core value, we've created interactions with our students that role model growth mindset. So we've created a mental health panel and a Pritzker I Screwed Up session. In the mental health panel, we have a group of people ranging from students all the way to deans at the medical center sit in an auditorium filled with 200 people and talk about the mental health challenges that they've experienced and how they've navigated their professional careers despite those challenges. The help that they've gotten, the challenges they've faced, the substance abuse that they've experienced, the suicide attempts that they've had, and what that meant to them and their family members. And we also do Pritzker I Screwed Up, where again, same idea, deans, course directors, faculty stand up, and they talk about mistakes that they made that impacted patients, sometimes in the ultimate way. These are incredibly well-attended sessions, and the students adore them. As fourth-year medical students, they're still coming back to the auditorium to hear the session for a fourth time. And the data shows that the mental health panel helped them understand the impact of mental health, promoted reflection on the importance of self-care and help seeking. It helped destigmatize mental health illness. And it also created a situation where they were more likely to seek out mental health resources. Now, we were skeptical about that. We wanted to see, and so we looked. We worked with the wellness center on campus, and we found that actually utilization of student counseling after we started these sessions went from 8% of our students to 33% of our students over a couple years. And that's compared to the regular campus, all the other students on campus who started out using mental health resources more than our students, but ended up using them less often than our students. So it was a dramatic shift by actually encouraging people to think in a growth orientation, to be more metacognitive in the way they think about their health. Growth is a core value in mentorship. So I'm responsible for the residency application process. We actually shifted when I moved from being a program director to being a dean of student affairs to a different model of advising that asked people to be adaptable, to actually emphasize diversification and judgment as opposed to algorithms in their approach to residency application process and specialty decision making. We gave them access to Pritzker-specific data. We used a CQI model that was a genuine CQI model with both a loop A and a loop B. And we did iterative monitoring. And what we found in our data was that the satisfaction rate as measured by the graduation questionnaire, which is done at all medical schools across the country so we can compare ourselves to other institutions, was 20% higher than the national average. That the match rate, the no match rate, that is the failure to match, was 1/3 of the national average. And we did that with students applying to 30% less residency programs than the national average. So we enhanced efficiency, we enhanced multiple different outcomes by asking people to be metacognitive in their thinking about the residency application process, okay? Not resort to standardized approaches or algorithms. Discourse. Discourse is an important topic for our country right now and also for our students. We have multiple venues that really rely heavily on discourse and allow our students to gain experience with that. We have a healthcare disparities course that was founded in 2006 that continues, which is based upon discourse. We bring in people from various identities to talk about their experience within the healthcare system. This replaced our cultural competency curriculum. It moved from cultural competency to cultural humility by actually asking us to look carefully at our assumptions, to confront our assumptions by encountering people from different backgrounds. And we formed an identity inclusion committee when the GOP nominee was announced in 2015. We knew we were going to have to set up a forum for meaningful discourse in our community on an ongoing basis into the future. So this committee now is over 10 years old, and it's a place where we actually pursue activities like a climate survey, town hall meetings, eye-to-eye workshops, and a number of other activities that explore identity. And you can see on the graduation questionnaire, on the question, knowledge or opinion was changed by perspectives of individuals from different backgrounds. We are in blue here compared to the national average and goal. So we have data that shows that there is an impact of creating these opportunities to pursue metacognitive exploration. In this case, social metacognition. What do other people think? What do I think of them? Am I correct in my assumptions? Okay. And then we teach civil discourse. We provide lectures on Loop B topics within the HERE course. We have workshops on ethical protest. We have the committee that I mentioned, op-ed opportunities, and then we have civil discourse events. And these events have been going on now for 10 years where students come to actually participate in conversations about society's most controversial issues. Okay, we're not picking softball stuff, you pick the hard stuff because that's the way they're going to get ready to take care of patients on the wards. The truth is, by the time they're a second-year resident, they not only need to know what civil discourse is and how to pursue it, they need to know how to facilitate it because they're going to be team leaders. And if they can't do that, if they can't facilitate it and they can't pursue it, then our patients suffer. This is not something that is for the grown-ups to learn. It's actually for everybody to learn. And in fact, in many cases, we're seeing our students do it better now than some of the faculty. So here are some of the topics that we pursue. Intellectual safe spaces, are those things that we should be using? The invitation of controversial speakers. Somebody around that time invited Steve Bannon to our campus to give a lecture. He didn't come in the end, but it was a huge controversy. We invited the professor who invited Steve Bannon to campus to participate in one of our civil discourse events. The students were ready to tear this person apart. And then the person said, I grew up in Italy. My father told me about fascism. He told me that we're going to have a problem if we don't engage these people directly. So I invited him to confront his ideas. And the students were like, they had no idea that was the intention because they made assumptions. They didn't explore their assumptions. They had no interest in the loopy thinking that was going on in his head. Is healthcare a human right, which we have regularly? And I tend to sort of have arguments about whether healthcare is a human right that may be controversial, but in the history of human rights as defined by the United Nations, there's a problem actually with simply using terms without thinking carefully about the implications of those terms. Free expression and medical professionalism, Trump versus progressive health policy. The picture is of actually two people. One is a progressive professor from our social services school, having a conversation with the director, the economic chief for Trump's first administration, okay, in front of our audience, and the students began to participate in the second half. This is how they learn to do loopy thinking. This is how they learn to pursue metacognition and self-regulation of their thinking. We are participating in the current National Networks Bridging Initiative, which is an initiative across 9 medical schools in the country that are trying to teach students and now nurses and faculty the importance of that metacognitive thinking in civil discourse. If people are interested in learning more about the current national network, please let me know. Fabrice also has some information. So we're interested in training professionals, not technicians, because it's only professionals that are going to be able to address the needs, the patient-centered needs of our patients. They're the only people that are going to be able to help with the cost of care. They're the only people that are going to be able to practice ethical medicine. And the subjectivity that is here on this slide under professional is not a sidecar. It's not just a course that's an add-on to a curriculum. The pursuit of critical thinking related to ethics and all the other value systems is an integral and inherent part, an unavoidable part of every decision that we make in the patient care environment. And it should be taught that way too. I just want to acknowledge a number of people. Some of you may know Dr. Holly Humphrey, who was my mentor for many decades and who passed away this past year, and she's a great loss to the medical education community. Monica Vella has been my partner, a fellow dean at the University of Chicago, and my wife. She was the dean for multicultural affairs. We worked together using these ideas to build the diversity of our school. Our school has 40% underrepresented medicine in all of our classes. Arnold Davidson, who is my philosophy mentor, Wei Wei Li, who is my associate dean. And then, of course, the Pritzker students who taught me so much about how to teach these ideas and what kinds of ideas would be helpful to them. So I'll stop there and answer any questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for an phenomenal grand rounds. I had a question about translation of your work beyond the UME realm. I think it is wonderful and beautiful and critical in the UME realm. But the truth is that our students also learn on the wards and our faculty and our residents. And when we don't model these behaviors, something's lost in translation. And so how do you take what you have done in communities of practice and workshops and discourse for students and get residents who have no time and faculty who aren't paid to engage and show up?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is a very important question. For me, it's not about either or. You have to start early because otherwise the system teaches them the conventions, right? And they get stuck in the limited learning organization mindset. And then you're really in a difficult position, right? So you have to start early. The question is, how can you roll it out further and further down the pathway? This past year, I've started doing these sessions for residency training programs, and the residents have been incredibly positive on it. Starts with a primer lecture, and then we start picking topics that are important to them. Our internal medicine residents were angry that they couldn't follow some of their Medicaid patients from the inpatient services into their continuity clinic. And there are reasons for that from an institutional perspective. We take care of more Medicaid patients at the UC than any other institution in the state. And our ability to sustain care on the south side of Chicago is only possible if we find some balance in how it is we take care of this unending flow of patients from the community through our emergency room. But the residents were very upset about this. So we had a civil discourse event on that. We had leadership from the institution, the residents, the leadership talked about this. And at the end of all of this, the residents said, like, we learned so much about how medical centers work from this conversation. It will help us think about our future careers and our ability to take care of underserved populations, because it does take resources to do that. When's our next civil discourse event? We have these ideas we want to cover. So it can be done for residents. For faculty, it's a little bit harder. I've done some grand rounds in the departments. I tried some of these ideas in the heat of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and I think I was just not ready for the level of anger and frustration. And so I think one important point is that this is not a panacea. It's not like you can just roll in and say, hey, civil discourse, and everybody's going to embrace it. You have to pick the right time and place. With KNN, we are now expanding this out to our nurses and our faculty. And so we are doing exactly what you're suggesting. We have to find a way to do it for everybody.
Thanks for an absolutely inspiring grand round. So this was fantastic. And I have the exact same question, actually, for research. How do we train and provide pathways to more non-dualistic thinking in science? And going out on a limb, even thinking about a shift from an I-it to an I-thou perspective on scientific inquiry.
Yeah, so that's really important. I have to say, quite honestly, I've done some presentations with scientists in the room, and the scientists have said, well, we think that way. And I'm like, I know you do, and actually the scientists probably do a better job of thinking both loop A and B than the practitioners and the educators, because their livelihood depends upon it, right? The quality of their research really hinges on them actually checking their assumptions. So I think they do a better job, but they could always do better. The scientism in our environment is mostly with practitioners and educators, and good scientists know that they're not discovering truth. What they are is uncovering evidence, which is something that is, again, lost often on the practitioners and the educators. But if you're interested in augmenting performance in science, as I said, if you actually go in, you can use ChatGPT and query, can you list all the discoveries over the last 200 years that represent changes in mental models? It will give you this vast list of the most important scientific discoveries over the past 2 centuries. Most of the most important discoveries occur with loop B thinking, not with loop A thinking. So it's worth thinking about how you could even augment performance amongst the scientists. Don't have an easy way of I haven't really gone into that area yet. Yes.
Thank you so much for this great talk. My question actually, in some ways, it dovetails nicely with the concept of I-thou thinking, or the rather than I-it, and that I feel like this has been a very kind of cognitive approach to thinking about this topic, including ideas like critical thinking and metacognition. And you have alluded to both human relationships and emotion, but I feel like those seem to be framed as outcomes of what you're talking about, rather than possibly, just more completely enveloped in the problem. So the way we relate to each other, great example is with learners on the wards, and then the emotional preconditions for being able to engage in metacognition and kind of other in the loop B thinking. And so I wonder how you think relationships and emotions should kind of start from the beginning or are part of the whole process.
Yes, so you're absolutely right. Like most of my presentation focused on the cognitive piece, but you also remember that the Pritzker I screwed up and the health panel those are some of the most emotional experiences that our students have actually in their 4-year experience. The room is filled with people crying. Oftentimes the speaker, the dean, is crying when they're telling the stories. It's what makes those events like the hallmark, the hallmark of the medical school experience for a lot of the people that are going through that medical school. So we have found ways of leveraging that. And in our efforts to do the cognitive piece, we try our best to acknowledge the emotional piece. As I've discussed with some of the students I was having dinner with last night, that it's not enough to understand this issue intellectually. You need to understand it emotionally. And until you understand it emotionally, your civil discourse will cease to happen as soon as you feel your identity or your politics is threatened. That's the hump that we have to get over, and you can't do that without addressing the emotions and the relationships which you're talking about. So we've been playing with that. It just is not the major theme of the presentation.
There's one last question. One more question.
I'll ask an easy one from the online audience.
Go for it.
Of the ones you mentioned in your lecture, which book or literature would you recommend reading as a starting point for addressing this objective?
So the philosophic literature. So for the audience, I think I would stick with something that is near and dear to our heart, and I think is near and dear to your heart. There's a book called The Diversity Bonus by Scott Page, University of Michigan. He's an economist and a complexity scientist. He's got an appointment at the Santa Fe Institute, and it's a popular book, but it's a book that has evidence and data, and it helps us reframe how we can think about civil discourse and how in problem solving, especially complex problem solving, he shows how diversity is an advantage. And that sort of captures some of that subjectivity. I'll have to think a little bit more about a book that's specifically about subjectivity, but Scott Page's book is a book that I often think about.
Thanks, Dr. Woodruff.
Sure.
So this is only the opening salvo, I may say, on this topic. So we're gonna do more of this type of work through the center and hopefully in collaboration with various departments and schools. But please join me for this fantastic talk. Thank you, Jim, for coming and joining us. So
Thanks.